Welcome to First Issues. Previously on the program, we spoke to Dr. Kiran Bhagat about stress as one of the most common lifestyle disorders in Botswana. It is defined as a natural reaction to specific demands and events in one's life. However, ongoing stress can greatly affect a person's health and well-being. Tonight, Dr. Kiran Bhagat is here to discuss another group of lifestyle disorders known as chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. What are they? Doctor, thank you so much for coming back on First Issues and affording us your time. We're back to continue our series on lifestyle disorders, right? And we are at COPD. What is COPD?
So COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is another long-winded way of saying it's a long-term disease that affects the lungs and causes them to be in some way unable to function they normally do. And because it's chronic and it's a lifestyle issue, and this is a lifestyle program, let's talk about what are the commonest causes of this condition and why it occurs. So the commonest reason why the lungs tend to block up, if you like, are things that the lungs are inhaling. And the commonest thing that people inhale that causes that blockage, and I'm sure our listeners guessed it, is tobacco. You know, when they smoke, they're taking in millions and millions of different toxins and poisons. And if you do that on a regular basis, whether it's through sniffing, you know, old grannies take the tobacco snuff, and even more recently, youngsters take vaping. We're now beginning to understand that all these things, whatever you breathe into your lungs, will actually ultimately insult the lungs. It inflames the lungs, and over a process of time, it causes the lungs to scar. And as the lungs scar, they can't open and close to draw in the oxygen. Oxygen doesn't get into the system, and as a result, there is worsening shortness of breath. In our parts of the world, in the developing parts of the world, the other things that can occur in our country particularly is industrial pollution. You know, if you live in a town, a village, or a city that has, for example, sulfur as its industry, you know, the famous one is in Piquet. You know, people would have, there's a much higher incidence of asthma. There's a much higher incidence of chronic COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because years of mining underground or mining when the air is polluted and breathing it in eventually causes that issue.
You mentioned earlier that, you know, people who live in environments that are ripe for air pollution also suffer from COPD and asthma. Perhaps you could make a distinction between the two. What is different about COPD and asthma? Are they somehow related, considering that the causes might be the same?
That's a very good question. And it's part of the same continuum, if you like. You have asthma, which often starts in childhood, and asthma is generally a reactivity of the airways to something that you've inhaled. It can be smoke, it can be perfume, it can be the cold, it can be sometimes something you've eaten. And in the younger generation, and it tends to run in families, and it tends to run in an umbrella of allergies. Like a child who's asthmatic may even have eczema and a rash. They may have sinus congestion because the whole body becomes allergic, and the chest tightens up because the airways tighten up, and because they're reacting, they're inflamed to whatever they've inhaled. And that's easily remediable by taking an inhaler, whether it's what we call a Ventolin or salbutamol, the blue inhaler, and a preventative inhaler. And most asthmatics, if they are faithful and adherent to avoiding the things that often trigger it and taking their inhaler, usually do very well. There is the other end of the spectrum of asthma, where we call it brittle asthma, where the allergies are so severe and you're using maximal inhaler therapy as well as pills, but they still have frequent admissions to hospital. Eventually, that type of asthma does cause irreversible lung damage, and some severe asthmatics can develop COPD. However, the principal issue of COPD is this issue of tobacco, but also, I guess in our rural areas where people are cooking with wood-fired ovens or inside with fire, the inhalation of that smoke we know can cause COPD. The other issue that also needs to be remembered amongst our listeners there is that if there is a smoker in the house, everybody in that house is affected, because you can have what we call secondhand smoke.
Obviously, we know what the causes are, and obviously with the causes we know how to prevent getting COPD, but is there any treatment, but preferably a cure?
I mean, it's one of those unfortunately difficult diseases where often they will present to us when the horse has already bolted, where they've done the damage and they've been a 60-pack cigarette smoker for years, or they've unfortunately done asbestos mining or lived in an asbestos house, or were working in a mine 30-40 years ago, and the damage has been done. And so when they come at that stage, all you can do is what we call symptomatic treatment, where you give them an inhaler to try and squeeze out whatever lung function they have. Ultimately, these type of people become oxygen dependent, and they actually have to either be housebound on continuous oxygen. There's now technology where you can have a portable oxygen thing, where you'll see them with their tubes in their nose and walking around with continuous oxygen. But ultimately, unfortunately, the outlook is very poor, and they tend to die in respiratory failure. In those parts of the world where transplants are undertaken, you need a new set of lungs. We haven't got to that stage yet, and I don't think anybody on the continent does lung transplants, but they are being done in North America, Europe, India and China with very good success.
See you again soon when pharmacologist and consultant cardiologist Dr. Kiran Bhagat continues the series on the most common lifestyle disorders, now to talk about dementia.